Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For decades, Russia and China have presented themselves as two powerful nations standing together against American influence and the Western-led global order. Their leaders shake hands at international summits. Their governments talk about a limitless partnership. Their media often portray their relationship as stronger than ever. But behind the public image, something much more complicated is happening. The war in Ukraine has transformed the balance of power between Moscow and Beijing, a conflict that Vladimir Putin launched in the hope of restoring Russia's influence in Europe, has instead pushed Russia into a deeper economic relationship with China than ever before. Today, China has become Russia's most important economic partner, its largest energy customer, and one of its main connections to the global economy. But does that mean Russia has become China's junior partner? Is Putin becoming dependent on Xi Jinping? The answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. The Ukraine war did not create a China-Russia alliance. Instead, it exposed the unequal foundation underneath their relationship. Russia and China may call each other partners, but they are not natural allies. They share thousands of miles of border. They have competed for influence across Eurasia for centuries. Their history includes territorial disputes, military confrontations, and deep strategic suspicion. What brings them together today is not traditional friendship. It is necessity. Both governments oppose American power and the Western-led international system. Both see cooperation as useful in challenging Washington's influence. But countries can cooperate against a common opponent while still distrusting each other. History has shown this many times, and the relationship between Russia and China may be one of the clearest examples. When Xi Jinping first became China's top leader in 2013, Vladimir Putin was someone Beijing admired. At that time, Russia still appeared to be a major independent power. It controlled enormous natural resources. It had a powerful military. It remained one of the world's most influential countries. For Xi, Putin represented a model of how a declining country could restore national strength and challenge American dominance. Xi's first foreign trip after taking power was to Moscow. The message was clear. China wanted a stronger relationship with Russia. At that moment, the relationship looked much more balanced. Russia had energy and military technology. China had money, manufacturing power, and a growing economy. Both sides needed each other. But the war in Ukraine changed everything. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia had a powerful economic relationship with Europe. For decades, European countries depended heavily on Russian oil and natural gas. Moscow used energy as a strategic advantage. Russia could sell resources to Europe while maintaining political independence. But after Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that relationship collapsed. Western sanctions cut Russia off from many financial markets. European countries rushed to reduce their dependence on Russian energy. The result was a dramatic shift. Russia lost one of its most important customers. China became much more important. Today, Beijing has enormous leverage over Moscow. Russia needs Chinese markets. It needs Chinese technology. It needs Chinese financial channels. And most importantly, it needs China as a buyer of its energy. One of the clearest examples is the long-discussed Power of Siberia 2 natural gas pipeline. For Russia, this project has strategic importance. Before the Ukraine war, Russia's largest gas market was Europe. After losing that market, Moscow hoped China could become the replacement. During Putin's recent visits to Beijing, one of his biggest goals was to secure Chinese approval for the pipeline. But Beijing did not rush to accept Russia's proposal. Instead, China reportedly demanded extremely favorable pricing conditions. The message was simple. China was willing to buy Russian energy, but on China's terms. This shows how much the balance has changed. A decade ago, Russia had more options. Today, China has more choices. Beijing does not necessarily need Russian gas immediately. China can wait. Russia, however, needs customers. That difference gives China bargaining power. The same pattern can be seen in trade. Since Western companies left Russia after the invasion, Chinese companies have filled the space. Chinese cars replaced many European and Japanese brands. Chinese electronics entered Russian markets. Chinese machinery and consumer products became increasingly important. For ordinary Russians, China has become the source of many goods that were previously supplied by Western companies. But this creates another imbalance. China's economy is much larger than Russia's. Russia depends heavily on China. China's economy, however, does not depend on Russia in the same way. This is why many analysts argue that the relationship is becoming increasingly unequal. But here is where the story becomes more interesting. A weaker Russia does not mean China controls Russia. That would be an oversimplification. Russia is still a nuclear superpower. It remains a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. It has one of the world's largest militaries and enormous natural resources. Vladimir Putin is also not a leader who wants Russia to become someone else's satellite state. His entire political identity is built around restoring Russia as a great power. Putin may accept closer ties with China. He may accept economic dependence. But accepting the role of a junior partner would be much more difficult. This is why the relationship between China and Russia is so complicated. China needs Russia. But China does not necessarily trust Russia. Russia needs China. But Russia does not necessarily trust China either. The two countries are cooperating because their current interests overlap, but their history tells us that shared interests can change. But there is another reason why the future of the China-Russia relationship remains uncertain. And that reason is history. For all the images of friendship, military parades, and diplomatic statements about a no-limits partnership, China and Russia have never been natural allies. They share thousands of miles of border. They share a long history of territorial disputes. And throughout history, they have often viewed each other not as partners, but as competitors fighting for influence in the same region. The modern relationship between Beijing and Moscow is actually a relatively recent development. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China were initially communist allies. Many people today forget that in the early years after the Chinese Communist Party came to power, Beijing looked to Moscow as its ideological leader and economic model. But that partnership quickly deteriorated. By the 1960s, the two countries had become bitter rivals. The ideological dispute between Mao Zedong and Soviet leaders eventually turned into a military confrontation. In 1969, Chinese and Soviet forces even clashed along the border at Zhenbao Island. For several decades, China and the Soviet Union treated each other as strategic competitors. The United States famously used this division during the Cold War. President Richard Nixon's opening to China in the 1970s was partly based on the idea that Washington could take advantage of the split between Beijing and Moscow. That history matters because today's partnership between China and Russia is not built on deep trust. It is built on shared interests. Both governments oppose what they see as a U.S.-dominated international order. Both governments criticize Western alliances. Both governments believe the United States has used its economic, financial, and military power to limit their strategic space. This common opposition has brought them closer. But a relationship built mainly on opposition to a third country is very different from a relationship based on genuine trust. The question is not whether China and Russia cooperate today. They clearly do. The question is, how deep does that cooperation really go? And the answer is complicated. For Beijing, Russia is valuable because it provides energy, natural resources, military technology, and diplomatic support. For Moscow, China has become essential because Western sanctions have dramatically reduced Russia's economic options. But their long-term goals are not always aligned. China wants a stable international environment that allows it to continue economic growth and expand global influence. Russia, especially under Vladimir Putin, has increasingly pursued a more confrontational approach, trying to restore what it sees as its historical status as a great power. These two visions can sometimes conflict. The most obvious example is Central Asia. For centuries, Russia considered Central Asia part of its sphere of influence. But in recent years, China's economic presence in the region has grown dramatically. Through trade, infrastructure, investment, and financial institutions, Beijing has become increasingly influential in countries such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other former Soviet republics. For Russia, this is a sensitive issue. Moscow may publicly welcome China's investment, but privately, it understands that its influence in the region is declining. A similar competition exists in the Arctic. Russia views the Arctic as a strategic frontier where it has special interests. China, meanwhile, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and wants greater access to Arctic shipping routes and resources. Even if the two countries cooperate today, they are also watching each other's moves carefully. This is not unusual in international politics. Countries can cooperate in one area while competing in another. The United States and China, for example, still trade with each other despite enormous strategic competition. The same logic applies to China and Russia. Their relationship is not a traditional alliance. It is closer to a strategic partnership of convenience. They need each other at this moment. But needing someone is not the same as trusting someone, and history suggests that relationships based primarily on temporary interests can change when circumstances change. This brings us to an important question. Could Russia eventually move away from China? Some American policymakers have considered this possibility. During the first Trump administration, some strategists discussed whether Washington could improve relations with Moscow in order to reduce Russia's dependence on Beijing. The logic was simple. If China and Russia are natural competitors, perhaps the United States could create enough incentives for Russia to distance itself from China. But so far, that strategy has failed. The biggest obstacle has been Ukraine. As long as the war continues and Russia remains isolated from the West, Moscow has few alternatives. China has become Russia's economic lifeline. Beijing understands this reality. And because Russia has fewer options, China has greater leverage. This is why the current relationship looks very different from the one that existed a decade ago. 10 years ago, Russia could still balance between Europe, China, and the United States. Today, that balance has largely disappeared. The war in Ukraine has pushed Russia much closer to China. But ironically, the closer Russia moves toward China, the more unequal the relationship becomes. And this may be the greatest strategic consequence of the war. The war did not create a stronger Russia-China alliance. Instead, it created a relationship where one side increasingly depends on the other. For China, this may actually be a favorable situation. Beijing does not necessarily need Russia to become stronger. A Russia that is economically dependent on China, diplomatically isolated from the West, and willing to provide cheap energy and resources may serve China's interests better than a fully independent Russia. This does not mean China wants Russia to collapse. A chaotic Russia, with instability, nuclear risks, or uncontrolled conflict, would create enormous problems for Beijing. China still wants Russia to exist as a major power. But perhaps a Russia that is weaker and more dependent is easier for China to manage. This is why the future of the relationship is so interesting. On the surface, China and Russia appear closer than ever. They hold joint military exercises. Their leaders frequently meet. Their diplomats repeat the language of friendship. But underneath that surface, there is a much more complicated reality. It is a relationship shaped by necessity, competition, and mutual suspicion. The history between these two countries tells us something important. Countries do not have permanent friends. They have permanent interests. Today, China and Russia share an interest in challenging American influence. But tomorrow, if their interests change, their relationship could change as well. For the United States and its allies, this is an important lesson. It would be a mistake to assume that China and Russia are either inseparable allies or inevitable enemies. The reality is somewhere in between. They are partners because they need each other. They are competitors because history, geography, and national ambitions push them in different directions. And that contradiction may ultimately determine the future of one of the world's most important geopolitical relationships. The Ukraine war has transformed the global balance of power. It has weakened Russia's position in Europe. It has strengthened China's leverage over Moscow. And it has created a partnership that looks powerful from the outside, but may be far more fragile than many people realize. The biggest question is not whether China and Russia will cooperate tomorrow. They almost certainly will. The bigger question is what happens when one side no longer needs the other. Because history has shown repeatedly that friendships built on convenience often last only as long as the convenience exists. And when interests change, even the closest partners can become competitors once again. Thanks for watching.